He didn't hit the brakes. He didn't lock the back doors. He didn't even make eye contact. In a city where looking away is a survival skill, 38-year-old Kenji Sato did the one thing no one expected. He saw the signal. It was a gesture so quiet, a tuck of a thumb into a trembling palm, that 99% of the world would have missed it. But Kenji wasn't part of that 99%. He knew what it meant because he had spent a lifetime responding to it. That split-second decision didn't just save a passenger. It ignited a city-wide manhunt, unburied a digital conspiracy, and turned an anonymous Uber driver into the most dangerous target in the state. This is the story of how a silent signal changed everything. The neon reflection of downtown Chicago smeared across the hood of the black sedan like a fractured oil painting. Kenji's knuckles were white against the leather-wrapped steering wheel, his breathing shallow and rhythmic, a habit from a life he had tried to bury under a mountain of 5-star ratings and polite small talk. Behind him, the air in the cabin was thick with the metallic scent of fear. Elara's "help me" signal had been a silent explosion, a flare sent up from a sinking ship, and now that Kenji had steered into the storm, there was no turning back. "He's reaching for something," Elara whispered, her voice a jagged sliver of sound. The man beside her, a syndicate fixer whose name was likely as fake as his polite smile, had dropped the act. His hand was no longer resting casually on Elara's arm. It was dipping into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit. Kenji didn't wait for the draw. He slammed his foot onto the accelerator, the electric motor of the sedan whining as it surged forward with instant, violent torque. The fixer was thrown back against the seat, his weapon snagging on the lining of his coat. Kenji ignored the GPS's polite request to make a legal U-turn and instead yanked the wheel hard to the left, cutting across 3 lanes of traffic onto Wacker Drive. Horns blared in a dissonant chorus, but Kenji saw the city not as a grid of streets, but as a series of tactical vectors. In the rearview mirror, 2 black SUVs detached themselves from the shadows of a parking garage, their headlights flashing like predatory eyes. They were moving with a synchronized aggression that confirmed Kenji's worst fears. This wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a professional extraction. "Keep your head down," Kenji commanded, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that Elara had never heard from her driver before. The chase became a blur of steel and shadow. Kenji threaded the needle between a slow-moving city bus and a delivery truck, the side mirror missing the yellow paint by a fraction of an inch. The SUVs were gaining, their engines roaring over the hum of the city. One pulled alongside, the passenger window rolling down to reveal the cold, matte barrel of a suppressed submachine gun. Kenji didn't panic. He timed the rhythm of the city's traffic lights, pushing the sedan through a yellow that turned red a heartbeat later, trapping his pursuers behind a wall of cross traffic. But they were relentless. They jumped the curb, the SUVs bouncing onto the sidewalk and scattering pedestrians like dry leaves. Kenji felt the old adrenaline, the black honey, as his former unit called it, flood his veins. He wasn't thinking about his rating or his rent anymore. He was thinking about the 4th precinct, 3 blocks ahead, a beacon of blue light in a world turning dark. He swung the car into a narrow alleyway, the stone walls scraping the doors, and burst out the other side directly in front of the station's barricades. He didn't slow down for the gates. He had made his choice. The silence was over. The 4th precinct stood as a monolith of concrete and reinforced glass, a supposed sanctuary against the lawless pulse of the city. Kenji didn't lift his foot from the accelerator as the car's proximity sensors screamed a continuous, high-pitched warning. Beside him, Elara braced her hands against the dashboard, her eyes wide as the world narrowed down to the looming transparency of the lobby. There was no time for a peaceful entrance. No time for explanations that would be ignored. Kenji gripped the wheel with a soldier's iron focus and steered the nose of the sedan directly toward the center of the glass facade. The impact was a sensory overload of shattering crystals and tortured metal. The reinforced glass didn't just break. It exploded in a shimmering curtain, raining down on the hood like a hail of diamonds. The car skidded across the polished marble floor, the tires shrieking as they fought for grip on the slick surface, before finally coming to a rest mere feet from the high, wood-paneled sergeant's desk. A heavy silence followed the crash, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant, rhythmic wail of a car alarm. Dust and the acrid scent of deployed airbags filled the cabin, but Kenji was already moving, his senses sharpened to a lethal edge. "Out, now," he commanded, his voice a low vibration that brooked no argument. He kicked his door open, glass crunching under his boots, and reached across to pull Elara from the passenger seat. She stumbled, her legs like water, but he held her steady, shielding her body with his own, as blue uniformed officers began to swarm the lobby. This was the moment of relief Kenji had promised her, the moment where the system was supposed to take over. But as the officers leveled their sidearms, Kenji felt a familiar, cold dread settle in his gut. He held his hands up, palms open and visible, watching the eyes of the men behind the sights. He expected to see confusion, perhaps the frantic energy of a precinct under sudden attack. Instead, he saw a terrifying, disciplined calm. The sergeant behind the desk didn't reach for a radio or call for a medic. He simply stood up, adjusting his belt, and looked past Kenji toward the shattered entrance. Behind the car, the fixer from the back seat emerged from the wreckage, brushing glass from his charcoal suit with a casual, practiced nonchalance. He wasn't reaching for a weapon, he was reaching for his phone. "Stand down," the sergeant barked, but the command wasn't directed at the fixer. It was directed at Kenji. The officers moved in a synchronized circle, their barrels not tracking the armed criminal, but locking onto Kenji's chest. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The blue light of the precinct wasn't a beacon of safety, it was the glow of a trap. The fixer stepped forward, a thin, predatory smile stretching across his face as he gave a slight, respectful nod to the sergeant. Elara gripped Kenji's arm, her fingers digging into his skin as the high-tech sanctuary transformed into a prison. The law hadn't arrived to save them, it had been waiting to collect them. The heavy click of the precinct's front door locking was a sound Kenji Sato had heard in a dozen different countries, and it always meant the same thing. The exit was no longer an option. The officers held their positions, their faces stony and indifferent to the glass-shattered carnage in the lobby. Kenji felt Elara's breath hitch against his shoulder. He didn't look at her. He couldn't afford to. Every instinct he had spent years trying to dull was now screaming at a deafening volume. He saw the tactical geometry of the room, the line of sight from the sergeant's desk, the proximity of the two officers to his left, and the overhead fire suppression nozzles that traced a path through the drop ceiling. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Sato," the sergeant said, his voice devoid of the usual bureaucratic boredom. It was the tone of a man who had already been paid for the outcome. The fixer, in the charcoal suit, moved to the side, leaning against a pillar as if he were watching a theater performance rather than a kidnapping. He checked his watch, a signal that Kenji's time had run out. Kenji didn't reach for a weapon he didn't have. Instead, he reached for the small, high-intensity tactical flashlight clipped to his belt, a relic of his contractor days. With a flick of his thumb, he strode toward the center of the lobby, pulling Elara with him. Before the sergeant could bark another order, Kenji smashed the heavy bezel of the light into the manual fire release station mounted on the pillar. The alarm didn't just sound, it shrieked, a piercing, dissonant wail that forced the officers to flinch. Instantly, the sealing nozzles hissed, but it wasn't water that erupted. Because this was a high-tech evidence processing precinct, the system deployed a dense, chemical fire suppression foam and gas. A thick, white fog rolled through the lobby in seconds, blinding the overhead cameras and turning the room into a featureless void. The blind was perfect. The officers began to cough, their disciplined line breaking as they scrambled for masks they didn't have ready. "Close your eyes and hold your breath," Kenji hissed into Elara's ear. He didn't need to see. He had memorized the floor plan the moment they crashed through the glass. He moved through the whiteout like a shark in silt, his hand anchored to Elara's wrist. He counted his paces, feeling for the transition from marble to the industrial carpet of the holding area. A stray shot rang out, a panicked officer firing at a shadow, but Kenji was already behind the heavy steel door of the processing wing. He used his body weight to slam the door shut, sliding a heavy metal chair under the handle. In the muffled silence of the hallway, he He looked at Elara. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering amber of the emergency lights. The driver was gone. The operator had returned. The damp chill of the midnight air settled into Kenji's bones as he navigated the labyrinth of rusted iron and decaying timber. The abandoned train yard on the edge of the south side felt like a graveyard for a forgotten industrial age, its massive skeletons of derailed freight cars casting long, distorted shadows under the flickering amber hum of distant streetlights. He led Elara through a narrow gap between two salt-crusted tankers, his movements fluid and silent, a stark contrast to the heavy, frantic pounding of her footsteps. This was the fringe of the city where the digital eyes of the syndicate struggled to reach, a place where ghosts could linger undisturbed. Kenji found a hollowed-out caboose tucked behind a stack of rotting pallets and signaled for her to step inside. The interior smelled of old grease and cold soot. Kenji didn't turn on a light. Instead, he knelt by the sliding metal door, his eyes scanning the perimeter for the telltale sweep of tactical flashlights or the silent approach of a drone. He felt the familiar weight of his past pressing against his chest, a ghost of service he had tried to exorcise with every mundane mile driven behind the wheel of a civilian car. He had spent years trying to forget the language of extraction and the geometry of a firefight, yet here he was, crouched in the dark with a woman whose life was now inextricably linked to his own survival. "They won't stop," Elara whispered, her voice trembling as she sat on a rusted bench. She looked small against the backdrop of the industrial ruins, her hair matted with the white residue of the fire suppression foam. "You don't understand what they're willing to do to get this back." She reached into the lining of her jacket, her fingers shaking as she pulled out a small, translucent casing. Inside, nestled in a bed of protective gel, sat a microchip no larger than a fingernail. It pulsed with a faint, rhythmic violet light, a heartbeat of pure data that seemed to defy the darkness of the caboose. Kenji looked at the chip and then at her. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same haunted clarity he had seen in whistleblowers and refugees in conflict zones half a world away. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a low, steady anchor in the dark. Elara swallowed hard, clutching the casing to her chest. "It's called the Aegis Protocol. My father built it to be a shield, but the syndicate turned it into a skeleton key. It doesn't just watch people, it predicts them. It maps every digital footprint, every private thought, and every physical movement into a single lethal algorithm. If they deploy this, there is no more privacy. There is only the grid." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "I stole it because I'm the only one who can delete the master key. That's why the police didn't help us. That's why the fixer was smiling. They don't want me back. They want the girl with the key dead, so the lock stays shut forever." The violet pulse of the Aegis Protocol was the only heartbeat in the freezing dark of the caboose, but it was enough to draw the hunters. Kenji felt the shift before he heard it, a sudden, unnatural stillness that swallowed the distant hum of the city. One by one, the amber streetlights on the horizon flickered and died, plunged into a void that spread like an ink stain across the Chicago skyline. The syndicate hadn't just cut the power, they had executed a total digital lockdown. The cellular towers went silent, the GPS satellites vanished from his mental map, and the city's smart grid became a sprawling, lifeless skeleton. In the sudden vacuum of the blackout, the silence was more terrifying than any siren. "They've blinded us," Elara whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. Kenji didn't answer. He was already moving, his hands working with the muscle memory of a man who had survived the dark zones of the world where technology was a liability. He knew the syndicate's strategy: kill the lights, kill the comms, and wait for the target to panic. They expected him to stay hidden, but Kenji knew that in a city of 10 million people, the only way to survive a digital dragnet was to become a ghost in an analog world. He led Elara out of the train yard to a small, nondescript garage tucked under a crumbling overpass. Inside sat a 1969 Mustang, a relic of raw steel and carbureted fury that Kenji had spent years restoring in his spare time. It had no computer chips, no GPS tracking, and no remote kill switch. It was a mechanical beast in a world of silicon, and tonight it was their only hope. "Get in," Kenji commanded, the ignition key feeling heavy and real in his hand. As he pumped the pedal and turned the key, the engine roared to life with a visceral, guttural snarl that vibrated through the floorboards. There was no touchscreen to greet them, only the steady orange glow of the analog dials. Kenji slammed the car into gear, the tires screaming as they bit into the pavement. He didn't need a digital map. He navigated by the stars and the silhouette of the skyscrapers against the moonlight. The syndicate's drones were likely hovering overhead, using thermal imaging to scan the blacked-out streets, but the Mustang's heat signature was buried in the chaos of the industrial district. He drove with a raw, physical intensity, shifting gears by the feel of the torque and braking by the scent of the pads. The city was a maze of shadows, a graveyard of stalled electric cars and dark storefronts, but Kenji moved through it with a predatory grace. He wasn't just driving. He was hunting for the gaps in a net that had forgotten how to catch a man who didn't exist on a screen. The lockdown was meant to trap them, but for Kenji, the darkness was home. The 1969 Mustang sat idling in a derelict drainage tunnel, its heavy mechanical pulse echoing off the moss-slicked concrete. Inside the cabin, the dashboard's orange glow cast long, haunting shadows across Kenji's face. He didn't kill the engine. The sound was the only thing keeping the oppressive silence of the blacked-out city at bay. Elara sat huddled in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the rhythmic violet flicker of the microchip. The air between them was thick with the residue of their narrow escape, but for Kenji, the darkness brought back a different kind of cold. It was the chill of a memory he had spent a decade trying to outrun, a ghost of service that finally demanded its due. "You drive like a man who's trying to get somewhere fast," Elara said quietly, her voice barely rising above the engine's growl. "Or someone who's already lost everything." Kenji's grip on the gearshift tightened, his knuckles white. He looked out into the pitch-black tunnel, but he wasn't seeing the Chicago underground. He was seeing the sun-scorched dust of a mountain pass in the Hindu Kush. He was seeing the smoke of a convoy that had been promised safe passage, a promise he had been paid to keep. "I was a tactical responder for a private firm," Kenji began, his voice a low vibration that felt as raw as the Mustang's exhaust. "My unit was tasked with extracting a high-value asset, a young doctor who had evidence of corruption within the regional governor's office. She was like you, brave, stubborn, and holding a truth that scared the powerful." He paused, the phantom scent of cordite and diesel fuel filling his lungs. "We had the plan. We had the tech. We had the impenetrable security. But I was arrogant. I believed that because we were the best, the variables didn't matter. I trusted the digital grid to tell me where the enemy was, and I ignored the human eyes on the ground." The flashback hit him with the force of a physical blow. The sudden, static-filled silence of the comms, the blinding flash of an IED, and the realization that the digital maps had led them into a kill box. He had pulled his men out, but the doctor hadn't made it. He had watched the light fade from her eyes while he waited for a rescue drone that was too far away. "I spent 10 years believing that if I just stopped moving, if I just became an invisible driver in an invisible city, I could stop the cycle," Kenji said, finally turning to look at Elara. The orange light caught the deep, unyielding grief in his eyes. "But seeing you signal in that mirror, it was the same plea, the same stakes. I failed her because I trusted the machine over my instincts. I won't let history repeat itself in this city. I'm not just driving you to a destination, Elara. I'm driving for the soul I left in that mountain pass. I cannot fail this time, because if I do, I'm not just a ghost. I'm the man who let the world go dark twice." The Mustang's analog clock ticked with a rhythmic, mechanical precision that felt like a countdown in the stifling air of the drainage tunnel. Kenji's confession about the mountain pass still hung between them, a heavy shroud of grief that made the confined space of the car feel even smaller. He looked at the orange glow of the dashboard, his mind already calculating the next move, but a sudden vibration broke his focus. It wasn't the car. It was the low, persistent hum of a smartphone, a device he had buried under a pile of old rags in the center console. He had kept it only for emergencies, but in a city plunged into a digital blackout, any signal was a beacon for the wolves. Kenji fished the phone out, the screen's harsh blue light cutting through the cabin like a knife. He hadn't touched his Uber driver app since the moment he deviated from the GPS, yet there it was, active and pulsating. A notification banner sat frozen at the top of the screen. Rerouting, please return to the designated path. His blood turned to ice as he watched the little blue icon representing his car on the map. It wasn't grayed out or stagnant. It was moving. Even with the city's grid dismantled and the cellular towers gasping for life, the icon was tracking their exact coordinates within the tunnel with terrifying sub-meter accuracy. "Elara, look," Kenji whispered, his voice tight. She leaned over, her breath hitching as she saw the map. "That shouldn't be possible. The power is out. The satellites are blocked." She reached out, her fingers trembling as she tapped the screen. The app didn't look like the version Kenji had used for thousands of mundane rides. Deep within the interface, a secondary layer of code was visible, a series of shifting, violet hexadecimals that mirrored the rhythmic pulse of the microchip in her lap. The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. The syndicate hadn't just compromised the city. They had built their surveillance into the very tools of the invisible working class. Every driver, every delivery person, and every gig worker was a mobile sensor in a global dragnet. Kenji's phone wasn't just a communication device, it was a Trojan horse. The Aegis Protocol wasn't just a secret microchip, it was already living inside the apps he used every day, waiting for a high-value target to trigger its full potential. The trader in the app had been sitting in his pocket for months, mapping his habits, his routes, and now, his final hiding place. "It's the chip," Elara gasped, clutching the translucent casing. "The app isn't using the towers. It's using the chip's localized frequency to ping the syndicate's private network." As if in response, the map on the screen suddenly updated. 2 red triangles appeared at the mouth of the tunnel, closing in fast. The silence of the underground was shattered by the distant metallic shriek of tires on wet concrete. Kenji didn't hesitate. He smashed the phone against the metal gearshift, the screen splintering into 1,000 dead pixels, and slammed the Mustang into gear. The analog beast roared to life, but Kenji knew the shadows were no longer enough. The ghost was out of the bottle, and the hunt had officially turned lethal. The roar of the Mustang echoed like a thunderclap against the damp concrete walls as Kenji pushed the car out of the drainage tunnel and back into the suffocating darkness of the city. Behind them, the red triangles on the now shattered phone had materialized into the very real, very lethal headlights of 2 armored SUVs. The syndicate wasn't playing a game of pursuit anymore. They were closing the distance with the intent to ram. Kenji shifted into third, the gear lever vibrating with raw power, and steered toward the Chicago River. He needed a choke point, a place where their numbers and technology would be neutralized by the sheer physics of the terrain. He saw his target, the Kinzie Street Bridge, its massive steel girders rising into the gloom like the ribs of a prehistoric beast. As they neared the river, a sharp, mechanical groan groaned through the air. The bridge was beginning to rise, its heavy iron leaves tilting toward the sky to block their path. "Kenji, it's opening!" Elara screamed, clutching the Aegis microchip to her chest. Kenji didn't lift his foot. He watched the gap between the rising bridge and the road widening, a jagged maw of darkness. He knew the syndicate had triggered the lift from a remote terminal to trap them on the embankment, but they had underestimated the weight of 1960s steel. "Hold on," Kenji gritted out, his voice a low, focused rasp. He didn't aim for the center of the gap. Instead, he steered the Mustang toward the massive counterweight mechanism at the base of the rising leaf. Just as the first SUV lunged forward to PT maneuver them, Kenji slammed on the brakes and yanked the emergency handle, sending the Mustang into a controlled 180-degree spin. The back of the heavy car swung around with the force of a wrecking ball, the reinforced steel bumper smashing into the front wheel well of the lead SUV. The impact was visceral, a scream of twisting metal and shattering glass. The SUV, tripped by the Mustang's weight, lost its center of gravity and tumbled sideways, its momentum carrying it over the edge of the embankment and into the black water below. The second SUV skidded to a halt, the driver hesitant. Kenji didn't give them a second to think. He slammed the Mustang back into first gear, the rear tires smoking as they fought for traction on the bridge's metal grating. He drove the nose of the car directly into the SUV's side door, pinning it against the rising girders. The bridge continued to tilt, the angle became precarious. Kenji used the car as a pry bar, the Mustang's raw torque shoving the lighter, high-tech vehicle upward along the rising slope until the SUV lost its grip and slid backward, crashing into a pile of wreckage. They were at the precipice. With one final gut-wrenching roar of the engine, Kenji cleared the rising edge, the Mustang momentarily airborne before slamming down on the opposite side of the river. They were across, the bridge now a towering wall between them and their pursuers. The standfast was over, but the war had only just begun. The Mustang's engine ticked as it cooled, the mechanical ping sounding like a heartbeat slowing down in the relative safety of a subterranean concrete bunker. They were deep beneath an old textile factory on the city's western edge, a place forgotten by every map except the one burned into Kenji's memory. The air here was stagnant, smelling of machine oil and the heavy, humid scent of earth. Elara sat on the edge of a rusted workbench, her hands still trembling as she clutched the violet-pulsing Aegis chip. She watched Kenji, who stood before a wall of seemingly solid brick. He didn't look like a driver anymore. The slump in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a coiled, dangerous energy that made the very air around him feel electric. Kenji pressed a specific sequence of stones, and with a groan of rusted counterweights, a section of the wall receded. Inside was his tactical rebirth, a cache of equipment he had sworn never to touch again when he left the mountains of the Hindu Kush. He reached in, his fingers first brushing over a matte black tactical vest, the ceramic plates heavy with the promise of protection. One by one, he pulled out the tools of a trade he had tried to outrun, a specialized signal jammer, a short-barreled carbine with a suppressed muzzle, and a wrist-mounted uplink device designed for ghosting through high-security networks. He laid them out on the Mustang's hood, the orange glow of the dashboard reflecting off the cold steel. "You're going to help me get inside, aren't you?" Elara asked, her voice small but steady. Kenji looked at her, then back at the gear. He wasn't just preparing for a break-in, he was preparing for a war. "I'm going to make sure the world sees what's on that chip," he replied, his voice a low, focused anchor. He began to don the gear, the straps of the vest clicking into place with a finality that signaled the end of his decade-long penance. He checked the action on the carbine, the slide racking with a crisp, metallic snap. Every movement was fluid, driven by a muscle memory that had never truly faded. He was no longer Kenji Sato, the anonymous driver with a 4.8 rating. He was an operator again, the ghost who had returned from the dark to finish a mission. He handed Elara a localized comms unit and a pair of tinted tactical glasses. Omnicorp HQ isn't a building, it's a digital fortress. They think their grid makes them untouchable, but they've forgotten how to fight someone who can operate in the static. He adjusted the uplink on his wrist, the screen flickering to life with a series of emerald codes that bypassed the syndicate's locked-down network. He looked at the Mustang, then at the entrance to the bunker. The drive for survival was over. The drive for justice had begun. He had spent 10 years hiding from the man he was, but as he stepped into the light of the bunker's exit, Kenji knew that the only way to save Elara and the city was to become the very thing the syndicate feared most. He was ready to take the fight to their front door. The glass tower of Omnicorp HQ pierced the blacked-out Chicago skyline like a jagged, obsidian needle. Kenji moved through the shadows of the executive plaza with a predatory silence, his matte black tactical gear absorbing the dim emergency lighting. Behind him, Elara was a ghost in the static, her tactical glasses projecting a glowing green interface that bypassed the building's biometric locks. They weren't just breaking into a corporate office. They were lancing a digital abscess. As they reached the central server hub, the air grew cold, humming with the vibration of 1,000 cooling fans. This was the heart of the Aegis Protocol, the place where private lives were harvested and sold as predictive commodities. "I need 3 minutes," Elara whispered, her fingers flying across the holographic terminal. Kenji stood at the doorway, his suppressed carbine leveled at the hallway. He could hear the heavy thud of tactical boots approaching. The syndicate's private army was closing in. But Kenji didn't feel the paralyzing guilt of his past failure. Instead, he felt a crystalline clarity. He was no longer a man hiding behind a steering wheel. He was the shield his father's daughter needed to finish the mission. "Make them count," Kenji replied, his voice a low, steady anchor as the first flashbang detonated in the corridor. The room erupted into chaos. Kenji worked the angles with lethal efficiency, his movements a blur of controlled aggression. He didn't fire to kill unless he had to. He fired to suppress, to hold the line, to buy the seconds that the world needed. Behind him, the terminal chimed. "The master key is deleted," Elara cried out over the roar of the alarm. "I'm initiating the public leak. It's going everywhere. Every news station, every personal device, every terminal in the city." As she hit the final command, the violet pulse of the microchip in her hand turned into a steady, blinding white light. Outside, the city began to wake up. The digital lockdown didn't just end, it shattered. Every screen in Chicago suddenly flickered to life, not with corporate ads, but with the raw, incriminating data of the Aegis Protocol. The bribes, the surveillance logs, and the secret contracts of the syndicate were laid bare for 10 million people to see. In the boardroom upstairs, the fixer and the tech mogul watched their empire dissolve into a sea of red, system-compromised alerts. The syndicate hadn't just lost their prize, they had lost their invisibility. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the Chicago River in hues of gold and amber, Kenji and Elara walked out of the service entrance. The tactical gear was gone, replaced by the simple, worn jacket of a driver. The city was loud again, filled with the sounds of a public demanding justice. Elara looked at the microchip, now dark and inert, and then at Kenji. "What now?" she asked. Kenji looked at the Mustang idling at the curb, its analog heart still beating strong. He realized he wasn't a ghost anymore, and he wasn't just a driver. He had found a new purpose, a guardian for those the system tried to erase. "The ride isn't over," Kenji said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "We just changed the destination.